time is ticking on, and there's a number of important topics we're going to still need to cover in the boot camp. But you're now in the favorable spot of being up to speed on all the basic mechanisms within any logic relevant to agent-based modeling. We're going to be looking today at some of the additional types of models that any logic supports in ways in which they can be hybridized. They can be brought together in a single group of a particular model. You can weave together different types of modeling. And in order to provide a little bit of orientation to that, I wanted to talk a little bit about, give an overview of the three major types of modeling that any logic supports, recognizing that these are not merely unique to any logic, but instead they represent three fundamental, very widespread and popular dynamic modeling approaches. Today, system dynamics, agent-based modeling, and discrete event modeling. This boot camp is quite focused on the use of agent-based modeling approaches, but particularly because of the capacity to hybridize truthfully with the other types of approaches, and secondly because you need to choose for a given project what approach you'll need or what approach you'll use for different components of a model. I did want to provide a little bit of comments by way of comments on these two. Well, social network analysis is a rich area on its own because it's often applied in a static fashion. I'm not going to be covering it here. There are dynamic versions of social network analysis which verge up very closely to some aspects of agent-based modeling. So I won't be discussing this as an important tradition. It's worthy of a course on its own, and I won't be touching it here. But just to make you aware, there's a gap there in terms of the coverage, both within any logic and in this lecture. But these three approaches being very widely used and being widely used particularly within health and being supported within any logic, I did want to talk about. So a very brief introduction of system dynamics. We will be seeing some examples of system dynamics models in the hybrid models we'll be glimpsing today. So system dynamics is a modeling approach that dates back further than agent-based modeling. It dates back to the late 1950s with Jay Forrester at MIT, who was a famed researcher in cybernetics and in fact in computer hardware, formulating an approach that's informed by cybernetics, by feedback-based systems control, an approach for understanding systems in the real world. And he was particularly interested in industrial systems that involved competition among companies, but also extended his work to a variety of other areas, some of them related to health. For example, the areas of urban dynamics, dynamics within the context of the city. System dynamics, more so than agent-based modeling, tends to be a fairly centralized methodology. It's advanced by a set of practitioners who seek to bring a consistent set of standards to it. And it involves both a perspective and a methodology, sort of a way of looking at problems and decomposing them, a way of describing them, characterizing them, as well as a particular technique for capturing them in the form of a simulation model. And it's aimed at conceptualizing, understanding, describing, analyzing, and perhaps most importantly in its tradition, managing feedback-based systems. And you'll notice when I talk about feedback here, it's central to the definition of system dynamics. System dynamics as a discipline centers around processes of accumulation and feedback, cases where a given change in a system ripples around to either amplify or push back against that original change. For example, someone falling into poverty may describe them, say, to a marriage that falls apart, may find themselves in a situation where they have limited access to transportation options, which limits their opportunities in terms of jobs and employment and jobs, and and leads them more likely to be resigned to a state of poverty for coming years. So that initial impetus is reinforced by that sort of situation. Conversely, so that's an example of a reinforcing feedback. There's also balancing feedback. Cases where a given change, say we grow hungry, leads to a rippling set of effects whereby, say, we go and obtain food, which makes us less hungry. That's called a balancing feedback. And many of the reasons that our bodies and other organizational systems, to biological systems, stay under control is because of balancing feedback. They keep us in a state of homeostasis or a state of balance with respect to various processes. So system dynamics has a central focus on feedback as shapers of behavior, and accumulations as over time as a key component of those feedbacks and as a cause for delay and sort of situations where a system is out of balance. System dynamics also tends as a discipline to be very interested in our cognitive limits, how we understand systems and the oversights we make in managing them, and trying to compensate for those oversights by building a formal model. It tends to emphasize stakeholder participation very strongly in the modeling process, which again is a thread that hasn't been really emphasized in agent-based modeling, although it's one which has tremendous potential with it, which I as well as Peter Hoffman and others have contributed with this group model, but work. The models in system dynamics, compared to agent-based models, are notable for admitting to formal reasoning and analysis. You can take the system dynamics model, you can analyze it in a formal way that will allow you to do things like comment on its possible modes of behavior, comment on how over all different possible values of the parameters, how it might behave in response. Talk about its stability, the degree to which it exhibits long-term behavior, and whether that behavior would be disturbed by attempts to interfere with the system, or whether it would be stable and resilient. So it can help you reason about the resiliency of situations. The fact that it is subject to formal reasoning allows us to make use of some additional tools which provide insight into how a model is behaving over time. One of the key tools of system dynamics in practice is the use of both qualitative and quantitative models. System dynamics as a discipline tends to try to emphasize delivery of insight and value in all stages of the modeling process, not merely when the final simulation model is developed, but from the very get-go. And one of the ways in which it does this is through a rich use of a qualitative modeling tool called the causal loop diagram. A causal loop diagram basically illustrates at a qualitative or semi-qualitative level, sort of semi-quantitative, so we can reason about where feedbacks might occur and what the character of those feedbacks would be, reasons about how a system might behave over time. And these causal loop diagrams have become increasingly used in the agent-based modeling area to sort of sketch out our understanding of the system. So broadly, this diagram depicts a set of interlinked variables, say the number of people who are susceptible, the number of new infections in the population, the number of contacts that occur between discordant dyads, people who are susceptible and those who are infected. And there are links between factors that are positive, that are hypothesized to have a causal link. So susceptible, for example, here impacts the number of contacts between susceptibles. And what that means is that a change in the number of susceptibles will tend to lead to a change, and the number of contacts, all other things being equal. And that change is typically be realized over some period of time. In this case, it's associated with a polarity, a plus, because an increase in the number of susceptibles will tend to lead to an increase in the number of contacts between number of susceptibles and infected, all of the things being held equal. By contrast, we'll also find cases where there are negative links. For example, as the number of new infections goes up, the number of susceptibles declines. And so this goes up, this one declines, hence we give it a negative polarity. Okay? These sort of diagrams are useful for sort of sketching out our posited set of interconnections between a bunch of factors in a way that highlights the feedbacks involved. And it turns out the feedbacks are depicted here in terms of these cycles. So where there's a loop here, we can identify it as either a reinforcing feedback, shown with a plus sign, or a balancing feedback with a negative sign. A reinforcing feedback is one of these amplifying feedbacks. It would be something akin to this. Let's see if we can make it like that. Cases where you have this squeal coming up because an initial sound is picked up, it's amplified by the speaker, is picked up in even a stronger form by the mic, amplified further, and it just grows and grows and grows. But we also see these sort of reinforcing feedbacks in the vicious cycles we know bedevil health and bedevil social problems. I mentioned earlier that the poverty trap due to these transportation. We also see it in addiction, for example. People get addicted, and the addiction drives them sort of substance use, escalating in terms of the nature of the substances used, and it furthers the addiction. So we see these sort of vicious cycles around. We also will sometimes see virtuous cycles, cases where two partners who are in a relationship that's initially problematic, find a way to one sort of reaches out to the other, and it's met by openness on the part of the other, reaches back, and the relationship goes in a good direction. So we could see vicious cycles as reinforcing feedbacks in arms races and poverty, etc. But we also see virtuous cycles as the reverse, cases where you get better and better and better situations. So those are reinforcing feedbacks. Balancing feedbacks are shown here with a minus sign with a loop indicator on it, and that's a case where there's some sort of balance. So, for example, as we increase the number of new infections, it limits the number of susceptibles that are there, which further limits the number of contacts with these susceptibles infected, all other things being equal, which limits the number of new infections. So this is a balancing loop. This is a loop that means that the infection, that the prevalence of infection in the population will tend to be limited in how far it can travel, because it can't go further than depleting all susceptibles. By contrast, this here with the positive loop is a reinforcing feedback that tends to lead to the infection taking off early on. So this amplifying situation. So we use these causal loop diagrams to reason about a system's connections, and we're particularly interested in system dynamics in these feedbacks because they drive the system in important ways. The feedbacks are not merely curiosities, not merely interesting descriptively. They often shape the behavior of the system in profound ways. Okay? So that's why they're sort of highlighted here. So this, in system dynamics, we typically formulate these causal loop diagrams early in a modeling project, and then we proceed to building quantitative models using it. And I'll talk a little bit about such models because they form a very important component of the hybrid modeling enterprise in any logic. And they're also well supported by that platform. I don't know why the ABM slide is in there. So when we proceed to quantitative models in system dynamics, they consist of two pieces. One of them is stocks. These are shown here in these rectangles, and those represent accumulations. They represent a sort of count of people, in this case, with certain characteristics. Those who are susceptible, those who are exposed, infected, or recovered. And then some accumulation of sort of the number of infections that have occurred over the entire time of the study. So these are, we could think of them as accumulations, we could think of them as aspects of kind of the current situation of the system, how many people are currently exposed, how many infected, how many recovered. Importantly, compared to agent-based models, they do not capture individuals. We can't really meaningfully say whether or not, how many times people have gotten infected within the population. We can't really quantify that because we're not tracing longitudinally people's exposure. So this is just a count of people. Whether those are the same people who are in the stock a year ago, you can't really say. It's just, in most cases, it just counts. The people are assumed to be sort of anonymous and faceless in this context. So these models summarize in a cross-sectional way a population over time, and it helps out. Okay? So we have these thoughts, and thoughts determine the state of the system, and they're implicated in disequilibrium phenomenon, and they lead to inertia. They can lead to a long time needing to pass before a system gets back into balance. For example, as long as there are some exposed people, there'll be infections coming about that will then further spread the infection. You may wipe the infection out in terms of current infected, but you'll still have to deal with these people who are coming from the exposed state into the infected state over time, or else the infection will again take up its spread. So these thoughts are associated with disequilibrium. Finally, there are these flows, and these are these sort of shown as these arrows between these thoughts, and these represent movements of people from one thought to the other. At a certain high level, they're similar to the transitions you see in state charts and any logic, in its state charts, but they are different in the sense that they are at an aggregate level. They represent a certain number of people per unit time, say per month or per week, going from susceptible to exposed. This would represent the number of new infections per week that are going on, for example, or the number of recoveries per week that are going on here. So these are the flows within these models. And there's kind of a reciprocal relationship where the flows determine the values of the stocks, the values of the stocks determine the value of the flows. So if they're just at a very qualitative level here, the number of new infections will determine how the number of exposed individuals rises over time. If there's no infections taking place, the number of exposed can only stay the same or go down. So many people leaving and no one coming in. So this flow, infection determines the stock value. By contrast, if there's no one in the infected state, no one will be getting infected. If there's no one in the susceptible state, no one will be getting infected. So the values of the stock, infected and susceptible here, determine values of flow. So there's this reciprocal relationship where they determine each other. The formulas you have to give in the system dynamics models are just for the flow. You specify the formulas for the flows, the stocks are directly determined from the net flow in and out of that stock. So basically, the action in system dynamics model building is specifying values for these flows and any intermediate variables up here, which often have fairly simple formulas associated with it. So in a system dynamics model, you specify formulas for each of these flows, and for these values here, you specify some constants, things like the total population or probability. Those are analogous to parameters we see in any logic. And it will figure out then what the implication of. You have to specify initial values for these stocks, how many people are initially there, and it will then dictate the trajectories of each of these stocks over time. So this is modeling within stocks and flows. For those for whom this is a meaningful statement, you should realize that these models are directly mappable onto and graphically capture and fully express or what are called ordinary differential equations. These represent differential equations. These equations that describe the rate of change of a system as a function of its current state. And that allows us to use a whole bunch of mathematical tools to understand why we see certain behavior. And so there are tools, just to give you an example, that use a causal loop diagram like this, and as the model runs, it will highlight which of these links are most active right now, which of these loops are driving the system behavior in a dominant fashion at this moment, and typically that changes over time. Over time, perhaps early in an outbreak, for example, take this loop here, as the number of infectives rises with increasing speed, and if this loop is dominant, like that, this one here, and then the one marked by plus, and then over time, this loop at the top, this balancing feedback will become increasingly dominant. The number of susceptibles is getting lower and lower. It's more and more hampering the spread of infection. The fuel for the fire is increasingly being used up, and the fire is going to shrink as a result. So you can use diagrams like this in a system dynamics context to illustrate what's driving the system at any one point. But it does so in a way that's anonymous to individuals. And there's a real trade-off with that because, among other things, you can't compare the data from the system dynamics model to individual histories you may have. You can't really directly take longitudinal data and dock it with the model directly. And moreover, you can't formulate policies that depend on the history of an individual in a textured way. So we can't, for example, treat people differently in a substantive way if they've come to our center more than 3 times before without engaging in a highly awkward exercise. So system dynamics modeling, a very powerful technique, one we use a lot together with our agent-based modeling, and one we'll see in our hybrid model. Okay? So that's system dynamics. I'd like now to talk about discrete event modeling. And I think to do this, just to liven this up a little bit, what I'm actually going to do, and you folks can figure out if you want to follow along, I'm going to go in AnyLogic and go to example models here. And I'm going to actually open up a discrete event model simulator here. And it's called the Trauma Center. And if you go to, so I went to Help, Example Models, clicked on Examples, and I scrolled down here on the right, and I went to I'm loading in the Trauma Center here. This is a model of a trauma center here in the States. It is designed to capture individuals' flow through this trauma center and the impact of resource constraints in the form of availability of nurses, technicians, physicians assistants, other forms of clinicians and doctors on the flow of those patients in the care conferred. Within this context, we have a facility mapped out, and the facility has associated with it diagnostic equipment such as x-ray machines, areas for emergency care. It has rooms for meeting with patients. This is the emergency department there, I think, and different facilities in different areas of it. And to run this model, I think I will view this, I will view this in, oh, okay, I must have closed that there, sorry. I'm wondering if, I'm going to increase the amount of memory in case that was a sign that it's memory starved, okay? I'm going to run this. Okay, and I'm going to view it in 2D context, I think, to speed things up. Oh, okay, it's not a happy camper. Oh man, that surprises me. I haven't seen this before. Okay, not sure what's up with this. I may have to abandon using this particular example. Kurt or Winchell, can you try to see what's going on with it? It's worked on those? Oh, well, that's good news. Okay, maybe I'll pick it up. Okay, so, oh yeah, okay. So what you should see is people coming into this system being met by the various healthcare professionals, being placed in a waiting area, proceeding from the waiting area to various waiting rooms, and being examined, and as required, being using the diagnostic facilities like the X-ray, and eventually being discharged out of the facility. So in this case, what we have is a set of processes that are healthcare delivery processes being depicted, and people flow through those processes. The people flowing through them are the patients, and there are these resources operating upon them. So Here we have a system that's workflow driven. It's sort of mapping out the experience of these individuals coming through the system according to some defined workflows. Workflow, for example, determining whether a CAT scan is needed, whether a VQ scanner is needed, an ultrasound, etc. And these individuals who come in and present for care are routed through the system according to their characteristics and needs. It's resource constrained, meaning the experience of a given patient in flowing through the system is dictated and constrained by the availability of resources. Resources in this case that are human resources, most obviously the presence of a VQ tech, the availability of a triage nurse or a doctor. But it's also constrained, ladies and gentlemen, by the availability of other resources like rooms, gurneys, wheelchairs to transport patients, the availability of x-ray machine, whether it's already in use, if so, someone will have to wait for it, etc. So it's resource constrained in the sense that if the resource isn't available, you typically wait, and sometimes keep those flowing through the system bulk. They leave the system because they're fed up with waiting so long. So it's resource constrained. There's some notable features of the system: the presence of queues of waiting lines, processes that operate on entities flowing into it. The patients here are viewed as sort of more passive than a typical and agent-based modeling. They kind of flow through the system, things get done to them, rather than them sort of taking charge of their in a intentional sense, rather than having a tremendous amount of agency. They are routed through the system, sometimes on beds and sometimes in wheelchairs, etc. There's flow charts that depict the set of workflow that is used to operate, the sequences of workflow to operate a patient. And there's resource pools that have limits, that have capacity to them. For example, there's only a certain number of doctors or a certain number of triage nurses that are available at a given time. So discrete event modeling is extremely widely used in certain areas of health, particularly in depicting areas of healthcare delivery. So it tends to be fairly downstream in its focus. It's dealing with people's encounter with an institution. Maybe it's a clinic, maybe it's a hospital. Perhaps it's a process like a TB contact tracing process. And it allows you to crisply represent processing in the context of limited resources. There's no question you could do this all in age-based modeling, but it would require a more articulated description and doing a lot of work on your own. On the other hand, discrete event modeling allows you to very nicely and parsimoniously describe the flow of people through the system. It allows you to identify the impact on health service delivery, the care conferred and the waiting time of level of resources, of resource coordination, of where those resources are placed within the facility, of facility layout. So if you're interested in knowing, where to put this cabinet, which contains the ultrasound scanners, or how many docs do we have on staff late night, this is the sort of modeling that can deliver a lot of insight with an economy of mechanism. And it has lesser reliance on computational skills than agent-based modeling. This is the sort of modeling we see. This is a depiction of another model provided with any logic. And notice it captures resource use. So in other words, these numbers here shown associated with each room indicate what fraction of time that room was in use over the last period of time. And that can be useful for reasoning about, do we actually need this extra room, or could we just do it with 4 rooms? And of course you can ask what-if questions. So these are the 3 basic types of modeling that AnyLogic supports. Notably, it supports combining them together within a single model. And this morning, we will be looking at a series of models very quickly that weave together multiple sorts of modeling within the same root. Okay? One of the great virtues of doing this, of supporting this, is that you're not locked into a particular modeling trajectory. In other words, you could undertake, say, an agent-based model knowing with confidence that if you run into something which is better approximated with system dynamics within it, for example, where we have continuous change in weight over time, then we can have recourse to this if we want it down the road. If we need a discrete event modeling component to capture clinic encounters and reason about balking on the part of patients when a new process is instituted, we can use discrete event modeling and introduce it where desired. We don't have to commit to one of these up front. We could start with a system dynamics model and then build in components that are agent-based in character. Have patients or have individuals turn at a certain level of risk progression into agents whose interactions are then captured. So the capacity to use all three types is what I view as perhaps AnyLogic's most defining and most attractive sort of feature, because it confers flexibility. It confers the ability to change, to learn from your experiences and change direction without throwing out a model and starting again. Very important from my experience. Now, having talked about this, maybe what I'll do is answer a few questions about those types of modeling, and then perhaps continue on to a discussion of some of the trade-offs between these methodologies. Not to suggest you can't apply them together, you can, but if you're considering different areas of a given model, when would it be best to use individual-based modeling, agent-based modeling, for example, and when aggregate modeling? So any questions about these types of techniques? I've presented them as necessary by the time at a very high level. And because of that, I figure there may be a number of questions that relate to some of the nitty-gritty of it, or to further unpacking high-level comments that made. So any questions about these types? Yes.
I feel like interface
Okay. Okay. Good. Good. So I have slides that talk specifically about this. One thing that I don't think I have in this particular presentation, but might be helpful, is for me to just hark back to a depiction where I talk about the different sorts of modeling, and this is, I think, on your drive. There's a thing called motivation for ABM, and within this I have a slide which might be helpful in making sense of this cacophony of different approaches, particularly with respect, yes, this is it, okay, here we go. So this might help, and you can let me know if it doesn't, and I'll try something else. So if we think about system dynamics, if we think about comparing these two types, this being sort of a depiction of an agent-based model, people on networks, situated in space, and interacting with each other as well as evolving internally. And here's the system dynamics model, which may depict the same basic real-world process, but it does so using shocks and flows. Okay, so I'm going to try to help shed light on sort of what's going on differently between them. I mean, both are structured representation. After all, here in an agent-based model, we might have a state chart, which at a certain high level has a mapping to this shock and flow model. So we have a state chart that might be susceptible, infected, recovered. We've seen it many times before in this weekend, right? So what's the kind of difference here? Let's talk about that a little bit. So within this aggregate model, this aggregate system dynamics model, here we have thought counting the number of people who are in a given category. We just have a count of this. We're not representing each of those persons as a defined entity. We're not representing them. We're not individuating them. We're not representing them in a distinct fashion. Instead, we're just counting the number that are in a certain state. here we are organizing the model. The model's kind of units and organization is dictated by the state people are in. And so, and their characteristics. So in this case, there's a susceptible person. And in fact, a number of people are susceptible, number that are infected, number that are recovered. That's a count of people who are in each of these cases. Let's suppose we wanted to distinguish men and women in this model, then we would need to create conceptually a copy of this model. So we would have male susceptible, male infected, male recovered, female susceptible, female infected, female recovered. Okay? So here we're kind of dividing people up and then counting the numbers that have certain characteristics. Characteristics according to their state, things that change over time, like their natural history of infection, and according to their characteristics, like male or female, or income decile. And you can only distinguish people with respect to here discrete categories. You can't distinguish people in a continuous fashion as to how susceptible they are or what have you. Instead, you can divide them into these categories. And as you start to introduce heterogeneity into a model like this, the size of the model starts to multiply. You start to go from introducing sex to introducing ethnicity. Now you've multiplied the model by another whole dimension, etc. But the key point is we're dividing people up and counting the number that have certain characteristics. Here, there's no real notion of multi-level modeling in the sense that we can summarize things, say, between cities. Maybe this is depicting within a city, but then we want to summarize multiple cities. Then we simply have to subdivide these people by city, and we could total up the number within a city, city 1, city 2, and then total up a number within all cities, but it would just be another variable in the model. There's no real hierarchy, there's no real nesting, there's no real division into successive levels or scales. Here it's sort of all at a horizontal level. All the variables are in the same sort of basic model. Okay. So if you have nesting in the external world, it's not really mirrored in the model. You'll just have multiple variables at different levels of aggregation within the same model. By contrast, in an agent-based model, the organization is different. In a system dynamics model, in an aggregate system dynamics model, we are organizing the model by people's states or characteristics. That's sort of the way in which we divide things up in the model. Those are the units of sort of by which we build up the model. Things representing characteristics, counting the number of people with certain characteristics or certain states. In contrast, in an agent-based model, we're dividing up, we're organizing the population according to individuals. We divide up the population into a set of individuals. And each individual here keeps track of their state. So we're not saying, okay, there's 101 susceptibles and 3 infectives or something like that, and just counting the number. We actually have individuals represented as such, and each of them is sort of keeping track of what state they're in. We can still compute aggregate statistics by going through and counting the number that are in a susceptible state, counting the number that are in infected states, but we have recourse to this lower level of, at the individual level, we can keep track of things. For example, if this person got infected before, the number of times they got infected before. So here, in an agent-based model, the people are subdivided according to individuals, they're individuated, and each unit maintains its own state. And if we have nested relationships, say, people in a school, in a neighborhood, in a city, in a region, we can capture that within our model in a nested fashion. Just to give you an illustration of that, of how that unpacks in any logic here, if you wanted to, you could follow along this. In the examples I provided, there's a hierarchical city population model here. I mentioned it before, but it basically depicts 2 different levels. So here we have a person, they're in a city. So each person here is embedded, has this logic, and they're embedded in a city. And then each city is in turn embedded in Maine. And what that allows us to do is to, when we run the model, we can end up finding, oh, okay, that's interesting. We have 9 cities, and each city has within it a population of people. So in this case, we have this multi-level hierarchy achieved within our model, not by flattening it within the same basic model, but instead capturing the mirroring that occurs in real world. We have people, we have cities, we have regions that can be represented as nested agents. People live within a neighborhood, and a neighborhood lives within a city, and a city lives within a region, and that's mirrored in our model. And that allows us to summarize statistics at those different levels in a very convenient way, and reason about different sort of types of processes that apply at those levels in a convenient fashion. I don't know if those comments are at all helpful. I think you put your finger onto several salient features of it. So there are certain processes, if we wish to capture them, we could do so with an agent-based model with greater precision and greater clarity, and in fact, represent them at all compared to what we could do with an aggregate model in any reasonable or realistic sort of way. An aggregate model is tends to be more it affords you less precision, the ability to specify things, and if you want to capture certain effects in an aggregate model, you can often do so, but sometimes requires gyrations and really awkward sort of changes to that model. And then there are some types of things you really can't realistically do in any aggregate model. All those things can be done in an agent-based model because from an agent-based model, you can always aggregate upward. Right? If you have individual level data, you can always create. Imagine for data sources, put aside modeling for a second. If you have recourse to data on 10,000 people at a longitudinal level, and it's individual level data, you can always create and it spans over 3 decades longitudinally, you can always create a series of cross-sectional statistics from that, right, at an aggregate level. And so it is with this. If you have an agent-based model, it affords you the ability to summarize things at an aggregate level, and in fact to slice and dice it in all different ways, because you have recourse to the a very fine-grained depiction, which you can summarize in any number of different ways. Within an aggregate model, you are limited in you can't make statements at an individual level, except in very specialized circumstances, and it's more limiting, and in terms of how you can break up the summaries or the statistics from it, you can only do so according to the categories you've distinguished in the model. So, for example, if you have been broken out within your model, infected individuals by how long they've been infected, you're not going to be able to comment on how many have been infected for such and such a length of time. Whereas in an agent-based model, you can readily compute that sort of information. So yes, you're right. The flexibility is greater at the agent-based level. There are certain things you cannot do with an agent-based model readily, and that is involved in formal analysis. You're not going to be able to use certain mathematical tools to kind of analyze what are the possible behaviors of this model, what are its equilibrium behavior, in other words, what are the possible sort of things that it tends to head towards over time, for example, and how stable are things. But if you're not planning to do a lot of mathematical analysis, agent-based modeling has very compelling advantages. A big disadvantage vis-a-vis stock and flow modeling is that, I think they just meant the caution is that with agent-based modeling, it's so flexible that you can very easily put more things in than you've really well thought through those choices. You're not constrained when you're adding things in to really think about it. I've mentioned that before. And second of all, with agent-based modeling, it tends to require somewhat more work to build up a basic model. However, that being said, there are times, and Kirk can attest to this, where you bang your head against the wall with an aggregate model to try to represent a certain type of process. And you're twisting yourself, you're contorting yourself to try to characterize a more rich process in an aggregate model. And it will be really easy to do in an agent-based context. And you can just, hit it, just knock it out of the ballpark really easily by characterizing an agent-based model. But for people getting started, it's true that system dynamics it offers a gradual on-ramp in it where the learning curve is steeper in the agent-based modeling space. Which might not have escaped people's notice. So agent-based modeling does afford a lot of extra power. It allows you to resolve certain things. It allows you to address certain research questions, but in a way that it will be difficult, if not totally impractical, within a system dynamics model. And it affords you flexibility that you're not going to get in the system dynamics model, in an aggregate system dynamics model. But it does so with requiring a certain capacity to describe the model that uses a bigger vocabulary. It's a little bit like, I don't know, I suppose it's, well, okay, I was going to use an analogy, but it's probably not a very good one. There are times where we could use a bigger vocabulary or a smaller vocabulary. We can get started with a smaller vocabulary, but at some point, it's worth it to learn the bigger vocabulary because you have more flexibility. You can express things with greater precision, greater clarity. And it's a little bit like that. In a agent-based model, you can represent continuous distinction, continuous age, things like metabolic rate or elements, the people's weight over time, fat-free mass, fat mass, in ways that really nails it with you. People's glycemic levels, their levels of blood sugar right now, and vary it continually. And you really can't do that in an aggregate model. It's really limited to discrete characterizations. You can divide people up into age categories, but then those are the only ones, or more granular versions of them that we can use to summarize things. We can divide things up into gender categories, fine, categorical infection status, but we really can't capture people, in very fine-grained level to what their birth weight is. It's typically totally impractical. We can keep track at a continuous level elements of, something like birth weight, no problem. It's just a parameter that's a double in any model. Does that help a little bit? Okay, let's talk about some of the trade-offs, though. Well, okay, sorry, this is one other thing. You will see in system dynamics models, there are no shortage of system dynamics models that have been created in the obesity area. And I'm quite familiar with some of them, having worked on them or been asked to critique them by the CDC, et cetera. And so there's a lot of things to look to there to learn from. One of the things you should realize if you think about an agent-based approach is some of the feedback that you see in a system dynamics model unpack into feedback within an agent at the level of an agent-based model. In other words, in a system dynamics model, there are some processes depicted that are operating at an individual level. At the same time, in the same system dynamics model, you will often see also processes that are at an aggregate level. It kind of mixes together things because they're all smushed into a single model. So here you have, for example, number of smokers, perceived desirability of smoking, breeds new smokers. This is positive feedback. And we could go on about how grounded this is. The point is, a positive feedback within a system dynamics model can unpack the things that are not positive feedback within an individual. They're more cross-individual characteristics. The reason there are feedback here is because all smokers are just they're just anonymous and they increase the number of smokers. And what this is saying is if you increase the number of smokers, it tends to lead to changes that ripple around and further increase the number of smokers. So it's a positive feedback here. At an individual level, it may be a process between individuals. It's not within an individual, so we don't think of it as a feedback at the individual level. You know, here, Johnny's father smoking affects his perception of the desirability, and then, you know, he offers it to someone else. And so the contagion occurs, but it's between individuals. It's not within an individual. So if you're looking to learn from models of obesity, for example, obesity-related risk factors, at a system dynamic model, you should just realize the agent-based characterization, because it brings greater precision and the ability to distinguish things at an aggregate and individual-based level, sometimes things that are in a system dynamics model as feedback, they unpack in different ways. And distinguishing that can actually be really valuable for insight. Okay, I think I'll leave that. I was going to, this is what I wanted to get to. I'm sorry, I'm in the wrong presentation. It has a comparable thing. Okay, sorry here. Motivation. This is what I wanted. Boom. Okay, so let's talk about some of the contrasting benefits here. With aggregate models, we often get easier construction up front for a fairly simple model. A little bit easier to calibrate because there are fewer moving parts often. You don't have to deal with stochastics. Perhaps most distinguished, you can gain better gain understanding through formal analysis of models. This is very attractive to a lot of mathematicians and those who are more quantitative. And I've done much there with that for publications in journals that are geared more towards mathematical epidemiology. These models are quicker to run. System dynamics models are quicker to run. It can be whip fast to run, unless you start to have lots of heterogeneity. In this case, they can get very slow. So you can have interactive running of them as you change assumptions. There's fewer moving parts in the model. Typically, there's no stochastics. If there are stochastics, it's frequently far fewer of them. And the skill set required to start building them up is closer to what you need to. In terms of kind of the mechanics of it, it's close to what you need with working with equations. And these things add up in the sense that you build them quicker, you can run them more quickly, and you use the extra time for understanding and refinement of that model. So you can iterate more quickly. You can run these things in 10 seconds rather than in 5 minutes, and so you can quickly iterate stuff. So aggregate models have some advantages. Individual-based models, this is most notably in agent-based models, they provide key benefits in certain areas. And these have significant overlap with things I've mentioned before. Representation of situated learning. If you have agents whose behavior will differ based on their perception of their local context, based on their personal preferences. So, we put a program in place in our clinics, and how people respond to it depends on their preference structure. The degree to which a co-payment is viewed as highly averse to them compared to less waiting time or what have you. If you have that, agent-based modeling is the name of the game. You can capture beautiful representations of people's choice behavior at an individual level in a way you just can't with an aggregate model effectively. Also, if you have learning going on, they're learning from their situation. Individual-based models allow you to support highly targeted policy planning. For example, policies or interventions that vary based on the history of a person or based on detailed characteristics of that person. Those can be captured in the individual level. You're not going to be able to represent those aspects of heterogeneity at an system dynamics model. Here, in an individual-based model, you can calibrate to and validate off of longitudinal data. If you have longitudinal data, you can really make use of it in individual-based models. You keep your model honest it can be served as a double cross-check. You can compare the results from the model longitudinally for synthetic series of people to the actual data that you have empirically. It can be very, very effective. On the other hand, with an aggregate model, you get a cross-sectional depiction over time. That's it. You don't know what a particular individual has done, how many times they've cycled, they visited the clinic or what have you. Individual-based model, you can incorporate heterogeneity much more scalable. You can incorporate lots of aspects of heterogeneity. Perhaps most importantly, you can do so flexibly. You can add things in, see if it's making a difference, see if you want to keep it, and take it out without modifying everything across the whole model. When you're modifying things in a system dynamics model to add heterogeneity, imagine here we want to add heterogeneity, we want to keep track of people's infections added by sex. We have to create copies of each and every one of these stocks and flows in the entire model to get them to capture whether we're talking about males or females. How do we do that in an agent-based model? So think back to your person fund. You created a person in an agent-based model. How would we add sex as a characteristic of that person in that model? How do we add sex? So we have a person. We have a person, just like we've done many, many times in the group thing. How would you add sex as a characteristic? Add a parameter. Back there too. So you add a parameter in, and that's it. It's a very localized change. It requires very modest investment to actually add that, right? You can experiment with it some and decide you want to take it out. Very simple to take it out. No problem. In a system dynamics model, if you want to add sex in as a characteristic of people in this model, you're talking about modifying the whole model. Now, for a model like this, it isn't too bad. It's a couple minutes exercise. But when you're getting to really data-rich models, and I can show you quite a few data-rich system dynamics models on my machine here, which I've worked with over the years, you're talking about eventually probably several days of work to add that in. And you've got to be really careful. You haven't introduced errors in the process. It's a highly intricate exercise. And the more types of heterogeneity you add, the harder and harder it becomes. And that's really inhibits your ability to try exploring, adding, different types of distinctions within your model in a way that you might want to take advantage of in your interventions or policies. You might want to say, look, let's do this in our work. We might be able to treat people differently based on this characteristic of them, and we can add that in easily to an agent-based model in a way we can't to a system dynamics model. Individual-based models allow us to examine our finer-grained consequences. If we're concerned, a persistent issue that comes up with many health conditions, and obesity is no exception, is that there are profound gradients associated with socioeconomic status, with different ethnic groups, and if we're not careful to distinguish people within our model by socioeconomic status or by ethnicity or what have you, we may end up viewing favorably simulated interventions that end up having highly deleterious transfer effects. They lower the overall obesity rate, to be sure, but they do so by much more favoring those who are more wealthy and higher income, and perhaps the adverse effects are barely help at all those who most need it in the lower income category. That would be viewed as highly objectionable from a standpoint of policy design. But that gets submerged in an aggregate model very easily because you're not breaking out these distinctions. If you're concerned about transfer effects, you're concerned about equity considerations, you're concerned about considerations having to do with the disparities in place, agent-based models can be much more effective because it's going to allow you to capture the distinctions, the heterogeneity that is going to be so important in examining whether we're worsening the disparities involved, whether we're worsening the the inequities we see already in the population. And, and frankly, you've got to be very careful with aggregate models, because if you're not breaking out certain distinctions, you may be making, in your recommendations for policies that come out of these models, you may be making implicit value judgments which say, well, as long as you improve the average, that is, what we seek. We seek improving the average, never mind whether some groups are disadvantaged and some groups are made more advantaged. These are, it's much easier to avoid making mistakes like that in an individual-based model than an aggregate model, because an aggregate model often those distinctions are submerged, and we're dealing with aggregates. We're dealing with averages over a big, diverse population. And we may gloss over and glom over the fact whether we are advantaging one group at the expense of another. Okay? This is a very serious thing when it comes to issues having to do with disparity. Individual-based model, we can characterize more precisely certain types of causal mechanisms. And this is very important for this group, I think, given some of the interest I've heard in this group. Multi-level modeling and multi-scale modeling, capturing things at different scales, it's just incomparably easier within an age-based individual level context, because we can capture these nested hierarchies and the ability to capture different levels of aggregation. So, if you had asked me 5 years ago about the trade-off, you would have seen a slide like this, but with maybe 2/3 of the items on it. I've learned a lot by being in the trenches, applying modeling in both these approaches, both of which I have seen, and both of which I view as very, very, very helpful for certain types of insights. And you won't find too many people who do both, and as a result, you will find it under conceptualized sort of what the important trade-offs are. I'm speaking here from direct experience with many modeling projects and from having seen some of the things we run into. I know it's a lot of information. I hope you'll recognize that these are sort of observations that are not based on some theory. It's more empirical observations from having run into issues with both sorts of models. So these are some trade-offs there. Now, I also have slides which I provided. I can make sure that they're certainly in the preliminary slides. I'll make sure that they're in the Dropbox here, the actual use slides. Sort of motivations. Like when people ask me, should I use age-based modeling? I'll say, well, do you have a need to reason about agent history? Is there are the agents, are you concerned that they're progressing on multiple pathways, multiple comorbid conditions, or multiple, attitudes and conditions? Are there learning or memory effects? Is there history dependence? In other words, their history, like their early life insults, strongly affect later life trajectories. These are all potent motivators for use of an individual-based approach, of which agent-based models are the sort of primary features. And again, I've added to this over the years. Conversely, I have a series of these that are for aggregate modeling. And they include a wide variety of types of conditions. For example, if you're focusing on changing mental models of stakeholders and you want to do so with a very, very simple model, if you're trying to understand the model behavior over all possible values of parameters, if you don't have really natural agents, if you're trying to simulate, this is unlikely to occur in this audience, but I've done work simulating management of reservoirs and water. You're not going to simulate that in agent-based model. I mean, it would be crazy, to try to simulate a reservoir using agent-based characterization. If you want to mathematically analyze the model, also unlikely to occur here. If you have stakeholders who really, really want to work at the level of aggregate depiction, if all you have is data at that level and understanding at that level, then these sorts of approaches can be very effective. And if you just want to get started very quickly, you want to try an approach very, very quickly and learn from it, you can undertake this. Kurt had a similar exercise that he underwent in his internship to the Ministry of Health, where he started with an aggregate model. He sort of learned from that experience, talked with people about it, used it to build up his knowledge about the system, and then he ended up in an exploratory step, which turned out to be prescient. He tried creating a hybrid model, which was agent-based and discrete event, and found that was able to address a lot of the very serious sort of limitations associated with an aggregate model. So sometimes people will do them up front, sort of explore an issue, to sketch out one of the relevant factors, to define the scope better, and then once they have a pretty good understanding of the issue, put in place more rigorous and more detailed and more precise individual-based models. Discrete event modeling. When would we use that? When would we use that type of modeling we saw earlier with people flowing to a hospital and with journeys and rooms and with x-ray machines and queues for them? Well, if there's a defined workflow involving several stages of processing, if you have things that flow through this workflow and are operated upon, when resources are required to process this, if you find people are waiting and the shortage of resources is a major issue, if you want to investigate your research questions, how would extra resources in this area, human resources, how would having an additional public health nurse help improve the efficiency of our operations? Discrete event modeling can be extremely valuable. The queues and waiting times are big concerns. Kurt's project is working on a Ministry of Health project involving, among other things, waiting times in emergency rooms, so it's broader in a sort of view of the system than that. And if the primary way in which things interact is through queues and resource availability, if the patients you have in your facility are not directly interacting, but are interacting predominantly through the presence of queuing, one person's experience is affected by another predominantly they have to wait for the resource, then discrete event modeling is highly helpful. And if you need to represent regular movement like through a facility on defined paths, it can be very useful. Fortunately, so I've given some motivations for different types of modeling, where the individual aggregate modeling often maps to system dynamics. That's the most common way of doing this at an aggregate level in health and system science area. Individual-based modeling often maps directly to agent-based modeling. You can split hairs and ask about microsimulation modeling and its relationships, but essentially I'm treating that as a variant of agent-based modeling with a slightly different perspective, as do other microsimulation modelers. So if we have these trade-offs here, these motivations for using them, the good news is with any logic in particular, we don't have to choose. We don't have to say we will go only with this. We can use one. We can then take out pieces of it and use those pieces, substitute another technique. We can, again, start with a system dynamics model, for example, and then at a certain point in their progression, health-wise, we can make them agents. And they can then be involved in networks and at locations around the city and interact as agents. Or we can have them as agents initially and put in a discrete event model to capture their visits to a clinic or a facility of another sort, or to capture their process through through some sort of bureaucratic processing associated with healthcare delivery, not particularly in a facility, but in general. We can very easily substitute in those pieces after the fact. We have the flexibility to do that. These are three types of modeling, though, that are very popular in health. The fact that we can weave them together will afford us a degree of flexibility that's rare. and that can be quite helpful for certain problems. So I'd be glad to answer questions on these. My thought was to use the next 45 minutes after any questions to just go through a couple hybrid models which weave these together, where you can see in concrete terms when we use one, when we use the other. So any questions on these? Yeah.
A quick question. So there are other programs like NetLoader and
Yep. Yep.
Does any language use any program that allows us to use all of this?
It is not its name, AnyLogic. It's that's sort of its raison d'etre. And it is the only one that allows you to weave all three. There is, I've heard rumors recently that there's some movement in the repass space to incorporate the ability to do some system dynamics modeling. I know a very prominent health researcher who is an agent-based modeler, but spent several months trying to get a model up, a model that incorporated some representation of metabolic dynamics using a system dynamics model in repass. He was able to do it by working with the creators of that platform after several months. And I would predict in another few years it'll be several platforms that will offer some sort of ability. I've also heard that I think that Simulate is starting to try to offer, it's a discrete events platform, and it's trying to offer a little bit of character flavor of agent-based modeling. I've also heard that Benson is going in a similar direction, although I'm not sure what that is. As far as all three methods, it's any one of them. Yeah. Okay. So that's a good question. I'll tell you my take on it, okay? And I speak as someone who rubs shoulders very closely with close collaborators with prominent microsimulation models. Okay, so I'm coming more from sort of an agent-based modeling background. The difference, there is some difference between agent-based modeling and microsimulation modeling, but it's a difference more in emphasis and sort of the approach you take to describing the problem, and not so much the difference in the mechanics of how you do it or the software's ability. In both cases, basically, we're talking about the types of features we're seeing in agent-based modeling and AnyLogic. But the way in which that approach in microsimulation tends to be much more statistically driven, because a lot of microsimulation gets done in large governmental organizations like the U.S. Census Bureau, Statistics Canada, various similar organizations in Europe, where there's voluminous access to longitudinal data on individuals. And so they tend to take a very statistical approach for describing people's evolution over time, and critically, and this is one of the big differences in the kind of historically how it's played out. In agent-based modeling, there's from early on been an interest in and focus on interaction between individuals in the model. And so that inter-individual interaction has been a major point of interest and focus, whether it's spread of infectious disease or norms or what have you. And that's been a point of great interest. In microsimulation modeling, a lot of work traditionally has gone on where you have agents that are solitudes, and you're simulating agents one at a time as they go through their life course, and you don't have to simulate them together. You simulate them one at a time, and because of that, you could secure some performance advantages by having having one machine do half the agents, and another do the other half. By treating them one at a time, you don't have to worry. You're not worried at all about their interactions. You're just simulating their life course trajectories. But in recent years, microsimulation has increasingly woken up to the fact that, assuming individuals as solitudes is maybe too big an abstraction. It's not that advisable for many types of conditions. a classic example would be where I have been in discussion with with a microsimulation modeler is StatsCan in Canada with cervical cancer. And, one of the things they've had to wake up to is that cervical cancer is a cancer that originates with HPV infection. And HPV infection is spread sexually predominantly, and therefore to really understand the likely burden down the road of cervical cancer, they're going to need to understand its transmission and transmission route. And that requires you to simulate, you can't simulate each woman in isolation from each other. You have to simulate the evolution of the population, including men, together over time to capture the interactions and the spread. And so increasingly, microsimulation approaches are basically almost indistinguishable from agent-based modeling in the sense that you're capturing agents as an individual level phenomena and their interaction over time. And the difference that does remain is a little bit in kind of how they would characterize some of the evolutions, the degree to which they use something like state charts versus variables whose evolution is defined according to certain statistical relationships they've derived from their data. We work quite a bit ourselves with ModGen, which is a popular microsimulation platform that originated in StatsCan, and we have a close working relationship with its creators. And we have models that are built in ModGen, like the same model built in ModGen, in NetLogo, in Repath, in AnyLogic, and in a custom built system in a language known as Scala. So we can compare side by side that particular model in all platforms. And so I'm pretty familiar with some of the tools there and some of the approaches. And I would say it's a matter of perspective and degree and kind of history. Microsimulation came out of economics and predominantly, and it is practiced by people often with an economic background, and that tends just to lead to how they approach it differently than agent-based modeling, which came more influenced by computer science. Is that helpful? Sure. By the way, I'm getting some good questions about different frameworks. I would be happy to provide comments if there were interest on different agent-based modeling frameworks that we've used. I've done a lot with Repath, a fair bit with ModGen, some with SDML, some with NetLogo. We use it quite a bit in my group. And if there were interest, I'd be glad to give a sort of open comment. I know I've done that one-on-one with some people here, and I'd be happy to talk about the trade-offs. There are many of them, from financial to sort of the features to ease of learning, etc. So if there's the interest, I'd be glad to do that. Yeah. System dynamics model and health. The most frequent platform you'll see people doing that in is Denison. There's quite a community also for iThink. It also goes by the name Stella, out of High Performance Systems. It needs to be changed their name in New Hampshire. Pretty sure they used to change their name. I don't remember what it is now. But in any case, iThink Stella, if you search for iThink, very popular. It's more of a beginning level package, a little bit not like NetLogo in the agent-based space, in the sense it's really geared towards teaching and getting people going early. But the serious people I know who are doing this, and I'm quite closely affiliated with a lot of them in System Dynamics, are doing it in Denison, which Denison as a package has a lot of baggage with history and so on. It really needs an overhaul, and we're trying to do that now, but it's a pretty good package, and I'd be glad to show it to people if they were interested. AnyLogic is the big contender right now. More and more people. PA prompting.